Welcome back to more Warhammer lore. In today's video, we'll be once again delving into the vampire counts of Sylvania. However, we will be focusing upon their founder and namesake, Vlad Von Carstein, also known as Vashanesh. If this is your first time watching one of my lore videos, you should know that I will be pulling all of the information about Vlad from the latest army books, as well as from the Warhammer fantasy novels, which I do prefer. So it will be a mashup of conflicting lore, but I will do my best to clarify the conflicts and which I support. Without further ado, let's get into the lore proper and start with the birth and life and inevitable death of Vashanesh. The man that would become Vlad Von Carstein was born Vashanesh, a Kymrian noble and blood relative of the infamous Nagash, though this would be a distant relation. Being a noble, even of such a disgraced name, would impart a degree of comfort and opportunity for the young Vashanesh, as well as a sense of entitlement and a hunger for power, which also may be something he inherited from his ancestor. You see, Vashanesh, while being of noble birth, was drawn to conflict and in fact joined the king's army at a very young age. He served as an officer and leader of men, and in fact was found to be an invaluable and rather cunning tactician. He rose through the ranks until he was the personal tactician of the general leading the army of Setep of Kemri. Through his station, he found out that they would soon be on the march and headed for Lamia, of all places. It would seem that foul sorcery was at work in the great city, and it smelled of Nagash. Vashanesh, being one to covet power, and knowing that his name would undoubtedly prevent him from rising much higher in society than he already had, found the allure of sorcery and the power of his ancestor had wielded over Nehekhara rather tantalizing, and instead of moving out with the army, he made his way to the city of Lamia ahead of the troops, and warned High Queen Neferata of the incoming attack. Though she somewhat already knew what was happening, Vashanesh made his talents as a military strategist and his knowledge of the invading coalition invaluable, and pledged to serve the queen in return for a taste of immortality. Now this is where we get our first lore conflict, of many, in the background of Vashanesh. In the army books, Neferata turned him and then wed him, making him the first king of the vampires in a way. But not only did this not happen in the novels, specifically the Time of Legends novels, but several other important events were omitted, either because the author simply didn't realize to put them in, or simply to save time and tell a more concise story. Either way, I choose to believe that Vashanesh was in fact given the blood kiss and turned, but Neferata, being the strong, independent woman she was, would not just marry anyone. In fact, up until this point, she was grooming another to be her king in Al-Khadizar, the very same man that was currently hunting her and her kind, and bringing the priest kings to erase her from existence. So, I do see her personally turning this man, as he was extremely useful as a leader and strategist, but that is the furthest of what she would do. Unfortunately for the vampires, no amount of strategy would overcome the sheer amount of troops at Al-Khadizar's disposal, as they easily outnumbered the defenders of Lamia 10-1, with only a small contingent of vampires. With Sorin of the Necrarchs would have to raise shambling zombies and skeletons to fill out the ranks, and even these would turn out to be not enough. Once the walls were breached and the queen personally wounded by Al-Khadizar, the heroic efforts of the rather conflicted Abarash bought time for the vampires to flee. Most of the vampires fled to the four corners of the Warhammer world, leaving Nehekhara and carving out their own places. Neferata set off to the east, seeking refuge in Cathay, while Abarash would wander many places, always traveling and on the move. And as for others, including Vashanesh, they would find themselves drawn to Cripple Peak, also known as Nagashizar. Here they found a home in the comfort of the newly cemented undead empire of Nagash, the ever-living, whom at this point was more of a lich or possibly even a lesser god than a man. Nagash saw these vampires much as the same as his immortals, though with less hassle, as they required no elaborate ritual or elixir to sustain themselves. They were strong, fast, and some of them were even gifted in the magical arts. They would make excellent leaders and captains in his armies to invade Nehekhara once again. Though they were undead, Nagash recognized that they appeared to still have complete autonomy, and to ensure no betrayal, began crafting several cursed items to control their kind, so that he could dominate them with minimal effort of his own will. Chief amongst these items was what would later be known as the Von Carstein ring, a very useful piece of jewelry, as Nagash explained to Vashanesh, who was in fact the vampire nominated to lead them, being of Nagash's own blood. The ring, while worn, would dramatically increase and rejuvenate the powers of the vampires possessed, as well as even resurrect them back from the dead, should they ever be cut down, as long as the pieces were gathered and brought together. What he did not tell him was that once the ring was put on, a link was established to the great necromancer, and the vampires under him were essentially enslaved to Nagash and forced to do his bidding to the letter. This might actually not have been too bad, except Nagash saw these vampires as simply another type of undead, and an expendable type at that. He threw many of them into suicidal missions with the forces of Nehekara and showed no remorse from the loss of countless vampires. It was at this point that Vashanesh, knowing that somehow this ring would be his doom, made a gamble in one of his final battles of the first invasion of Khemri. During a heated duel with Alcadizar the Conqueror, Vashanesh let the Priest King cut him down. As he died, the link controlling his kind was severed, and the few remaining vampires fled from Nagash's armies. And true to form, the ring did bring him back to life after the battle was over, and he too fled to the north to escape the necromancer's wrath. From here, Vashanesh disappeared from the history books, though we do know that sometime shortly after his liberation, he took on the name of Vlad Von Carstein, and began to start his own cabal of vampires, with his first turn being another noble of Nehekara before its fall, a man that resembled him uncannily and perhaps even reminded him of what he had once been. I am of course talking about Manfred von Carstein, first in line of Vlad's lineage, a most important figure in Warhammer lore. Now, well over 1,000 years would pass before Vlad would make another notable appearance in the Warhammer world. This time he would show up in the Empire, in the downtrodden and some would consider cursed lands of Sylvania. At this time, the Von Drack family were the current rulers, with Otto Van Drack being the Elector Count. The Van Dracks were certainly not known for their kindness to their people, and in fact many of their neighboring provinces would consider their treatment of peasants barbaric and possibly bloodthirsty, as they were ruled over with a form of terror and brutality. But that was coming to an end as Otto was on his deathbed. Being not only a cruel man, but a stubborn one at that, in an effort to keep his brother from inheriting his position, Otto put out a summons to any man of noble birth that if they would simply come to Sylvania and marry his daughter Isabella, they could have his lands and holdings. As anyone would be preferable than the thought of his scheming weasel of a brother ruling over what should be, by all rights, only his. Unfortunately, despite her beauty, Isabella was still a Van Drack, and might have had a bit of a bloodthirsty streak, especially for a noble lady, and every suitor that traveled to ask her hand found the woman too much to handle, and thus Otto's brother was going to assume the throne. That was until the arrival of a mysterious stranger who came just moments before Otto would breathe his last. The stranger was tall, built sturdily, and gave off an aura of power and martial prowess. His nobility was unquestionable, though his extremely pale skin and odd accent told the current count that he was a foreigner from some far-off land. He introduced himself as Vlad von Carstein. "It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Van Drack, as well as yours, fair lady, an exquisite rose amongst these withered thorns." Isabella blushed at the compliment. Something was strange about the man, as the healer from the church collapsed as he entered the room and began babbling on about the rawness of him, as well as every man that met his gaze quickly averted their eyes or found an excuse to leave his presence. Isabella's uncle was furious and began berating Vlad. "I have no time for you, little man," and picked the man up with one hand and tossed him across the room. "I see we have a priest. If he can be roused, as the Count will surely wish to see his daughter wed before his passing. And you, Isabella, it is custom for the bride to say yes at least once." For all his charm and charisma, Isabella saw something barely restrained and animalistic in his eyes, and saw this as her opportunity to get out from under the thumb of the Van Draak men. "If you would have my hand, Von Carstein, I would ask of you a wedding present. I will give you anything you wish if it be in my power," replied Vlad. She pulled him close and whispered something in his ear. "As you wish." Vlad strode across the room, almost too quick for the eye to see, and snatched Isabella's uncle off his feet. The man desperately fought to break his one-handed grip, but could not, and Vlad plunged his free hand into the man's chest and ripped his still beating heart out in a savage thrust of gore and blood. He handed the heart to Isabella, who took it in both hands and smiled, one of her first true smiles to the man. And with that they were wed, and destined for each other. Though this marriage was supposed to be but a sham, to Vlad's surprise he found this mortal very interesting. She was one of the only humans that ever could resist his will, and she had more in common with his kind than the cattle. Together the Count and Countess ruled over Sylvania for many years, and slowly over time the Countess pieced together what her husband was, and repeatedly asked him to turn her. But she did not know what she was asking, and Vlad repeatedly refused, not wanting to damn her soul, tethered to this plane in this half-existence he has come to know. And it dawned on him, despite her tantrums and ruthless nature, that despite the lack of a beating heart, he loved this woman, even more so than anyone he had had ever while a mortal man. In fact, all his aspirations of acquiring more power were lost for a time, and he simply enjoyed his unlife with his mortal bride. But alas, the Countess was persistent, and constantly asking him if he truly loved her, and if he did, why he wouldn't let her join him for eternity. Vlad, despite the pain it caused him, still refused to grant her wish. And then Isabella fell ill. So ill that she was bedridden. The Count called for healers, holy men, and even men of science in an effort to cure her, but nothing worked, and racked with grief and rage he did not know still resided in him, he tossed them all out. He shuttered the blinds and had all the reflective surfaces removed from the room. A few days later, Isabella was seen walking amongst the living, despite the disease that had ravaged her body. Every commoner was reverent, as the rule of Vlad and Isabella was actually one of prosperity for the province of Sylvania, as opposed to the Van Draaks. However, her recovery was questionable, as every commoner that had taken with this plague had died a terrible and grisly end, and yet their Countess was cured. It was truly a miracle. Vlad, of course, had given her the blood kiss, and to his surprise during the process, she had more readily than any other he had turned slurped down large mouthfuls of his own blood, in fact making her much more stronger than many of his other guests, and tied to him in a way beyond simply love, as they shared a bond that reached across the boundaries of the mortal plane. She was even more beautiful in death. Her skin had turned a porcelain white, and her eyes were as hungry as ever. She simply now had the ability to act on all of her urges that had interested the Count in the first place. Together, Vlad and Isabella ruled Sylvania for much longer than even the eldest of the peasants could remember. But this could not last. Vlad, however, was once again drawn into a state of melancholy. The excitement and sense of power that had satiated him for so long was beginning to wane, and even the company of Isabella was not enough to bring him out of his gloom. That was until an opportunity presented itself to the Count in the uncovering of a very ancient and special magic he had witnessed long ago. Vlad came into possession of one of the black books of Nagash. Now, we cannot be entirely sure that this was simply fate, or the work of the book itself, as Nagash's magical artifacts have a tendency to be drawn to fulcrums of dark magic, and vampires are in fact beings of pure dark magic. Either way, the book seemed to brighten his mood, and plans he had laid to rest were rekindled. Now, this could have been the desire of Vlad himself, or it could have been the work of the book. It is actually rather hard to tell. What came next would be a shock to the mortals of the Empire, and they would know their place at the feet of their betters. During the time in this history of the Empire, a time of relative peace had put the humans into a state of lax. There were no major chaos invasions or orc wars, and the various provinces had resorted to warring with each other over small land and trade disputes. The time was rife for a rebellion, or in this case an undead incursion. But first Vlad would need an army, and though the peasantry of Sylvania loved him, and they, at least as much as a man loves a favored cow set to slaughter, the human rabble would not make for a very formidable army. Even the vampiric aristocracy he had built over the years would not be enough. But with the book, he could have his army, and the Empire would fear the name of Vlad Von Carstein. And so preparations were made, and through the combination of a rather peculiar plague and a resurgence in the cult of the arisen dead, the mortals of Sylvania, no little more than death, and all kinds of dark creatures were drawn to the land. It was then that Vlad, in a masterful stroke, arranged for a grand ball, and an opportunity for all the mortals that still held leadership roles in Sylvania to pledge their fealty to him in person during the festival of Totentans, or the Day of the Dead, to commoners, on the ever-eventful day of Gehemensnatch. Of all the nobles and important men and women of Sylvania were gathered in a ballroom at Castle Drakenhof. Vlad ordered the doors sealed and the exits barred, and after a ostentatiously and overly glamorous introduction, gave the order for every living thing to be killed within the ballroom. For his part, Vlad did not take in the slaughter, but all of his kind that had gathered, as well as his bride, was steeped in the blood, dyeing her dress a crimson hue, and slaughter and death was brought to Sylvania in a wave that was not seen in many years. It was shortly after that the Book of Nagash was opened, and a great ritual was undertaken to raise all of the fresh corpses into unlife, and the armies of the now vampire counts was mustered from graveyards across Sylvania. They marched from Sylvania and into Essen Ford, where an imperial army had gathered, investigating rumors of the risen dead. Though Vlad's tactical genius and the underestimation of the Empire, it was an overwhelming victory for the vampires, and would be the first of many. However, the true strength of the vampires was fear, and Vlad wished for the fear of his kind to be spread throughout the Empire before he overtook each town. And so he ordered captives to be taken from the humans, and lined them up. He then had several of the humans bled dry by his hungry vampires, before asking the captain present to pick a man to let live and spread the message of the vampire counts. He refused, and so Vlad allowed the youngest amongst them to flee and spread his fear. But while he was distracted, the captain did something unthinkable. He charged the vampire and ripped his own sword from his sheath, where he then beheaded the vampire lord in front of his army. Of course, he was quickly slain, but in a state of shock, the vampires began fighting amongst themselves over control of the undead horde. Many were killed, until Hermann Posner claimed to be the strongest present. Isabella had fallen into a state of shock at the death of her husband. When Posner found her, she was repeatedly chanting to herself that Vlad would never leave her, that he would come back. She was obviously broken, but that didn't matter, as simply her presence would validate his rulership. Posner led her outside the tent and presented her as his new wife to the undead army, and asked if any would challenge his rule. By this time, a day had passed, and he had already secured the loyalty of most of the vampires present. But, to his surprise, a voice called out from the back of the camp. The undead shambled aside, and the vampires averted their eyes in shock and reverence. Vlad von Carstein walked through the parted crowd to where Posner was holding Isabella. The countess broke free of his grip and ran to her husband, sobbing. "I told them you would never leave me." The count cradled her for just a moment, then met the eyes of this would-be usurper. "This can't be possible. I saw you take the final death. You are but a ghost." And with that, Vlad drew his blade and proceeded to duel Posner, and made short work of this fool. But Isabella demanded the final blow. "I told you he would come," and sever the vampire's head from his shoulders. He would not be returning like his sire. In this fashion, Vlad would personally oversee every major battle. Each victory for the undead expanded upon the horde and weakened the humans of the Empire. If they did not die of plague or famine, the peasants and lay people would be butchered by the vampires, creating a unique air of dissent amongst the mortals. And some men, rather than die by the hands of the undead, were allowed to serve in his army. In fact, whole regiments of these mortals were employed to guard the coffins of the vampires and to fight their fellow man in open battles. The Empire was desperate, and clung to the hope that if the vampire lord was slain, that the horde would dissolve. But no matter what they did, Von Carstein was unkillable. He had been shot, stabbed, run through with a lance, blown to pieces by a cannon. He was even struck down by a rune thane and beheaded, and still he persisted. Then finally the horde reached the walls of Middenheim, which has never been successfully sieged, and some hope was revived. But it was short-lived, as Vlad, utilizing the Book of Nagash, grew tired of sending his undead horde to no effect, and instead sent a mass of wraiths and ghosts to bypass the walls and slay the defenders, thus toppling the ever-standing city and snuffing out hope from many until Altdorf was only the last bastion of the living. At this point, Vlad's cause grew even more than he had predicted. No one actually knew how he was coming back to life, with the exception of a handful of vampires. But for the most part, even the undead did not know what was happening. They saw him as a divine being, a god amongst their kind. And so Vlad's horde had grown, and he had even added powerful warriors to his ranks in the form of the late Knight Commander of the White Wolves, Jarek Von Carstein, as his now lieutenant. He stood before the walls of Altdorf before the siege and gave an ultimatum to the people of the city. There is no need for this needless siege. You can either serve me in life or slave for me in death. And with that, the long siege began. To the defenders' credit, they persisted much longer than expected, and the various runes and materials of the walls, along with the priests sent to bolster their defenses, kept most of the ghosts at bay, so as not to suffer the fate of Middenheim. But the living were losing a great war of attrition, and slowly the city looked as if it was on the brink of falling. Vlad, after a few months of repeating this same ultimatum, was growing tired of the cattle resistance to his rightful rule and seemed to become more and more bloodthirsty. Each morning the siege would lift, the living would recoup, and the dead would sleep, leaving the zombies and skeletons collapsed at the foot of the walls to be resurrected anew. That is until one fateful morning, when Vlad awoke to find that a mere human had infiltrated his tent, and worse yet, had taken the Von Carstein ring. In a fit of rage, Vlad pressed the attack against the wall personally, and this time, several breaches were created as the undead swarmed over the attackers. In his fury, Vlad slaughtered all in his path, looking for the treacherous human who had dared steal from him. This is until he squared off against a mountain of a man, the current Grand Theogonist of the cult of Sigmar. The man was but human, and in a more controlled state the vampire lord would have easily killed him, but in his rage he gave in to his more cruel machinations and was toying with his prey. It was then that the Grand Theogonist, in a culminating moment of self-sacrifice, threw down his weapon and tackled the Count. Despite his age, Sigmar was with him, and even the vampire's inhuman strength could not break his grip. Vlad cursed and thrashed as his captor leapt from the wall, still holding him tight, and spit himself and the vampire on a wooden stake at the base of the walls. The wood punctured through Vlad's chest and through the Grand Theogonist, and the massive bulk of the man pressed him down further. Vlad von Carstein, leader of the vampire counts, husband of Isabella, and father of darkness, died this day, and his zombie hordes collapsed. The day had been won, but at a great cost. The living would seek retribution, as well as the dead. The Count's corpse was buried face down in a coffin lined with garlic and silver, and who better to watch over this abomination than the man who stopped his slaughter, the Grand Theogonist, whom was buried above him in hopes that his holy vessel would keep Vlad from ever resurrecting again. Of course, there is much more to the story that would happen throughout the end times, and there is much more to do with the Vampire Wars, which we will be covering through the various individuals we will be going into throughout this very lengthy study of the vampire counts. And with that, that wraps up the history and the first death of the undying Vlad Von Carstein. Now we move on to our Total War section now. Vlad actually has a pretty good translation from tabletop to Total War. His one weakness, of which there are not many, is that he can't be taken on a mount. Not even a horse, meaning that he can be easily exploited in PvP by cycle charging him with large units. But should he get protection from Blood Knights or some other large creatures, he can be an unstoppable killing machine. This is mostly due to his rather ridiculous amount of staying power. Not only is he heavily armored, but he has access to the Von Carstein ring, which, as you guessed, constantly heals him at an accelerated rate. He also gets his legendary sword, Blood Drinker, which in the lore, when unsheathed, howled and screamed as it drank the blood of its victims and transferred its effects to the wielder, making it ideal for a vampire, as simply killing with the weapon has the same effect as drinking from a corpse. It gives massive stat buffs and also imbues regeneration, very similar to the ring. Vlad also, in the campaign portion of the game, gets access to the ability to Vanguard deploy his entire army, which for a vampire count army is rather significant, as they firmly rely on engaging in combat as soon as possible, and starting nearly on top of the enemy is a good way to do that. He also has a leadership buff for himself and his units if his army is reinforced by Isabella in representation of their undying love. Now Vlad is probably one of my more favorite characters in the Vampire Count's roster. He is that penultimate count vampire that you see from the movies, but he's got that little bit of a twist. I mean, he was capable of love, true love at that, not just a duplication of it. And that says something about his character, as most vampires have a lack of all emotions other than hunger and death. And that wraps up this lore video on Vlad Von Carstein. Now, if you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section, and there is technically more to his story, but once again, that doesn't happen till the end times, and he was truly dead for the most part until his miraculous resurrection in that storyline. On a whole, Vlad is a product of his kind. He was born a man, not an evil man, but a man, lustful for power. And after his change, the vampiric curse brought forward his worst traits, mainly pride and a lust for even more power than he had before. Though he did have some redeeming qualities, as he did in fact fall in love and held a special bond with his wife Isabella, on par with any romance you may have ever read about in history. They actually did care about each other. Now, as usual guys, I would like to say thank you for watching this lore video until the very end. A lot of people don't. And I would like to throw out a special thanks to my loyal subscribers and all my new converts into the cult of Thick. I greatly appreciate you thick boys out there. If you haven't already, feel free to both like this video and subscribe to the channel to help support me in producing more videos. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Have a good day.